Hey there, it's me again, Figmenter. Have you ever struggled to create perfect shapes, speed lines, emphasis lines, lines for form shadows, hatching, or maybe you've just wanted to learn how to use the lasso fill tool effectively? In this video, I'm going to teach you how to use the figure subtool to draw and fill perfect shapes, add form shadows, hatching, smears, and other effects. This video will be divided into 4 chapters. In chapter 1, we'll go through all the basics of using the default figures in the figure subtool palette. If you're feeling confident enough, feel free to skip ahead, where I'll be sharing how I tweak the figure subtool settings to get the effects that you see right here. In chapter 2, I'll share with you some very awesome techniques to supercharge how you use figure tools. This includes understanding curves, objects, and special layers. Then in chapter 3, I'll discuss the other 2 types of figure tools, which are the speed lines and focus lines, otherwise known as the streamline and saturated line. In chapter 4, I'll go through some applications and ways to use these tools in your illustrations and manga panels, and also how to make the most out of Clip Studio Paint's figure tools. And as a bonus, I'll break down how I use the figure tools to enhance the image in the thumbnail. Feel free to skip to any of the chapters annotated in the description. Chapter 1. The basic default direct draw tools. Under here, we have the direct draw tools. The direct draw tools fall into 4 categories: the continuous curve, the unit curve, and the figure, and the lasso tool, which isn't really related to any of the 3 aforementioned categories. I'll go over the default ones first. So we have the straight line. As the name of the tool suggests, it's used to draw straight lines. This tool is actually the unit curve tool, but it only allows you to draw in straight lines. To use this tool, simply drag your cursor from the starting point of the line you wish to make up to the end point. You can change how the line behaves from the start to the end. The starting and ending options lets you specify how the lines change its behavior from a portion of the start up to a portion in the end. This is good for creating artificial tapering. The curve tool. Draw it out like a straight line by tapping on the canvas to establish your origin point and lift up where you want the curve to bend. Like the line tool, you can specify how you'd like the curved line to behave at the start and at the end, making it easy to fade in and out or to taper off. Polyline is a variation of the continuous curve that allows you to create open or closed objects with straight lines. All you need to do is tap on the places where you want the corners. On raster layers, you can have the option to fill the spaces where the lines close off, or where the start and the end of the polyline intersects with the corners. When you don't close off the polyline, you can enable the option to control how the line behaves, similar to how you can do it with the straight line and curve tools. And now for the continuous curve. As the name suggests, this tool is used to create an open or closed shape composed of continuous curves. You use this tool to draw continuous curves, and you can do so by tapping where we want the curves to pass through. Clip Studio creates splines automatically. You finish the stroke by either pressing enter or by closing off the shape. On a raster layer, you have the same fill and stroke options as with the polyline, because as I've said, the polyline is basically a variation of the continuous curve. And here's the proof. There are 4 ways to draw a continuous curve. You can either draw it as a polyline, tapping on where you want the corners to be. Spline mode, the default way continuous curve lets you draw curves, where you click and tap on places where you want the line to pass through, and let Clip Studio Paint figure out how the curve splines through those points. Quadratic Bezier, good for creating rounded shapes with various corners, where you tap on where you'd like to drop the control points, but it's a lot less intuitive to use than the spline mode. And then there's Cubic Bezier. It's like a combination of spline mode and quadratic Bezier. You click and click, tap, then hold where you'd like the curve to go along. While holding, you can control how the curve behaves. This allows you to get sharp corners on your curves. This allows you to get sharp corners on your shapes as well as curves. If you only tap instead of holding, you get a sharp corner. Then we have the default Bezier curve tool. It's basically the continuous curve previously mentioned, but just on a separate preset tool. Now on to the figure tools. First, we have the rectangle tool. You use the rectangle tool by tapping and dragging to create a rectangle, then lifting the pen where you want the other corner to sit. The rectangle is a member of the figure subtool category, but it only allows you to draw rectangles. Like continuous curve, figures can fill with or without an outline on raster layers. If you check Adjust Angle after Fixed, it will allow you to rotate your shape along the center of your initial tap, drag, and pen lift. Just drag across the canvas to rotate. This is also true for all figures. You can also opt to draw out rounded corners or not. All the figure tools allow you to change the brush shapes like the continuous curve and unit curves. I'll discuss aspect type settings when I discuss the shift key modifier after this section on figures. The next figure we have is the ellipse. The ellipse tool lets you draw ellipses. By default, it allows you to rotate it after you have set the ellipse. Like the rectangle, simply tap on where you'd like the corners, where you'd like the circle to touch. And then we have the polygon tool. The polygon tool lets you draw triangles, parallelograms, and just about any sided shape. It operates much like the ellipse tool. You simply just tap and drag where you'd like the corners to start, and then lift when you get the size and dimensions you'd like. Then you're free to rotate the shape as you please. You can opt to have rounded corners as well. Remember I mentioned earlier that I discuss aspect type options when I discuss the shift key modifier? Well, here's the gist of the shift key modifier. Basically, holding the shift key while using line, curves, and figure tools affects how Clip Studio Paint lets you draw. Now, for the tools that let you draw closed shapes like the ellipse, rectangle, and polygon tool, holding the shift key will let you draw regular shapes, meaning all sides are equal. And for the ellipse tool, it allows you to draw perfect circles. And holding the shift key while rotating your shape will snap the angle of rotation by 45 degrees. Going back to aspect type options, the figure allows you to fix the ratio of your shape even when you hold the shift key, meaning holding the shift key won't have any effect and it will only follow the aspect ratio you specified. I suggest to just use the shift key and disable this aspect type options by default, and only use it when you really need to. For continuous curve, polyline, unit curves, and straight lines, holding the shift key will snap your cursor along 45-degree angle increments. And now for the oddball among the figure tools, first tab, the lasso fill tool. As the name suggests, it's a combination of the lasso tool and the fill tool all in one. You can set how much you'd like Clip Studio Paint to stabilize your strokes with it, as well as its blending mode. And here's how you can supercharge the lasso fill tool's usability. You can use the lasso fill tool as a silhouette generator by adding and subtracting solid forms. And you can toggle either additive or subtractive mode by pressing the C key. You can also use the lasso fill tool with varying opacity to achieve certain effects. The lasso fill tool is exclusively for use in raster layers and masks, and can't be used in vector layers unlike the other direct draw tools. Chapter 2: Objects, Curves, and Vector Layers. So I mentioned that we can supercharge our direct draw tools, and that involves us using objects and vector layers. Normally on a raster layer, once you commit a stroke, you can't change any of the settings anymore. But in vector layers, each line or stroke can be manipulated as either strokes or curves. This is because each line or stroke in the vector layer is treated as a separate curve object. Let me demonstrate how we work with curves. By default, curves drawn, unless it's a Bezier curve, is a spline curve. Pressing Ctrl on a curve object will let you edit it. While holding Ctrl, you can right-click to add more control points, switch control points, or delete control points. You can move the control points by tapping and dragging, or move the entire curve or stroke by clicking and dragging on its bounding box. And this is the part that makes working with figures in vector layers all the more powerful. By going to the Object tool, you can manipulate the existing strokes you have on your canvas. And this goes for shapes and figures as well. So this means that you can also change shapes however you'd like. Not only that, you can easily use vector arrays to combine and manipulate shapes as well. That's it for Direct Draw palette. Let's move on to Chapter 3, the Streamline and Saturated Lines palette. Chapter 3, the Streamline and Saturated Line palettes. One of the more obscure tools in Clip Studio Paint is the Streamline tool. By default, I can hardly find any way to use them, but you can start tweaking these tools and combine them with other techniques so you can get more out of them and achieve really nice effects. So let's start with the default Scattered Streamline tool. This tool lets you draw on an open or closed curve, and it will draw random horizontal lines across wherever you drew curve or figure. By default, it creates a new speed lines layer whenever you create a stroke. By default, it's pretty random, and I can hardly find a way to use it effectively without changing the settings. Next, we have the Dark Streamline. This is just like the Scattered Streamline, but just has thicker, varying lines. I still find it quite difficult to use on its own by default, so we will learn how to tweak these streamlines later on. Next, we have the Gloom subtool. This projects vertical lines from an arbitrary point down to where you put your curve or stroke. You can readily use the Draw Gloom lines on your manga characters to put gloom lines on their heads. The Rain subtool is very similar to the Gloom subtool. You can readily draw varying vertical short lines across where you draw the curve. This is by far the most useful among the default tools and lets you add a bit of a rain effect. These 4 default tools can be useful on their own, but you can unlock their full potential once you understand how they work, and I'll show you how. First, let's create a duplicate of a scattered streamline and adjust all the properties so that there won't be any disarrays. And we're also going to uncheck some of the options and turn on some of the options as well. So the explanation for the settings are as follows. The destination layer. This dictates whether you'll be making additional lines in the same layer or you'll be creating a new speed lines layer each time you create a stroke. By default, creates a new speed lines layer each time you create a stroke. Make curve. Aside from controlling where your lines are drawn, you can also control how the lines themselves behave, how they curve along your stroke. To understand the rest of the settings, let's draw a curve and go to Object Tool to examine what each of the option does. With the Make Curve option turned on, you can see this red line, which is actually a curve that dictates how your lines are drawn across the canvas. The angle setting dictates at which angle the lines are drawn. This can have some really cool effects when used in conjunction with a curved stroke. The gap of line setting adjusts how big the gap between the lines is, and the disarray will just adjust how varied and random these gaps are. Grouping will group lines together depending on the number, and you can introduce some variance again with this array, as well as adjust the gaps in between the groups. The length controls the length of the lines that are drawn. Take note that when the length exceeds the red line of the curve, it will straighten out, and introducing this array will vary your line length. You can click the arrow on the right of each of the disarray bars to enter a manual value of randomness. The reference position option controls where the line is drawn with respect to the curve you drew on the canvas. Your line or curve can either be the start, the middle, or the end of where the lines are drawn across. Gap from reference position option controls how far the lines are drawn from your curve. The higher the value, the further away the lines are drawn, but this is all in random. Brush size dictates the thickness of your lines that are drawn across your curve. Again, you can introduce a bit of randomness with the disarray controls. You can change the shape of your brush as well via changing the brush shape. The starting and ending section will let you control the curve behavior as it starts or ends. You can add tapering on your lines by adding a minimum value to the brush and adding a start and end point value. The percentages controls from how much of the line from the start or the end the tapering occurs. You can use percentage of the length of the line or specify the actual length. I mostly use percentages because we typically vary the length. The mode lets you control the manner of how you can manipulate this object. Personally, free transform is probably the best one here if you're not changing the control points of the curves manually. You can combine the effects of each of these to achieve something like a slashing motion or something that indicates form shadows, movement, and other effects. Then we have the saturated lines palette, otherwise known as the focus lines. The settings for the saturated lines palette is almost the same as that of the Streamline, but the behavior of the lines in this section is quite different. So let's go through the default tools first before I explain the difference. Scattered saturated line lets you create emphasis. Dark saturated line or curve is the only unique one in this palette, as it lets us draw a curve that we can possibly leave open, unlike the rest of the tools here that only allows us to draw shapes and ellipses. The dark saturated line curve is useful for adding impact lines. Dense saturated line is like scattered saturated line, only without grouping, meaning they are equally distributed. Brightness can also be used with a lighter value to add an effect like a bright light is coming from somewhere. Burst can be used with varying brightnesses as well to get a sort of explosion or impact effect. Now, the main difference between the focused lines and the streamline is that when it comes to focused lines all converge at one point and projects from that point outwards or inwards. Again, we can see how each setting affects the focused line by creating a duplicate of the tool and cleaning up all the settings, removing all disarrays and unchecking all the options, as well as enabling all the disabled options. Like with Streamline, we can choose to either edit on existing layers or create new layers each time we make a focused line. Unlike the Streamline, you can choose how the lines are spaced. You can either space them by angle, setting how many degrees each line is apart, or you can use the distance between each of the lines along the curve you just drew. And again, the disarray function will introduce some random variations in the gaps. Grouping is much the same. You can control how many lines are being grouped together, as well as the gap size in between the groups. The length controls how long the curves are, and you can also introduce some randomness with the disarray. Reference position dictates how we're using the shape curve we drew, whether it's the start, the middle, or the end of where the lines are drawn. Gap from the reference point option controls the variation from where the lines are generated along your curve. Uneven reference position height will control how much the gap will vary, and the number will vary how random these variations are. Brush size will vary how thick or how large the lines are drawn, and you can also change the brush shape to achieve various other effects. And as with Streamline and other figure tools, you can change how the start and end of the line behaves using the start and end of the line settings. You can also change the path of the curve using the red curve, similar to how we bend the lines in the Streamline using the red curve. This concludes the first 3 chapters of the figure subtools. Now, on to the applications. While there is absolutely no substitute for good draftsmanship and developing the skill to become a good draftsman and artist, using the figure tools can help you speed up some of your workflows, especially when you want to add objects, speed lines, emphasis lines, motion blurs, form shadows, and a number of other things. You can easily draw straight or round objects using the figure tool, and then you can easily add or subtract objects from each other if you're using them as vector objects. Here you can use Streamline to easily add shadows on your objects. If you were painting, form can be defined by how soft or hard the edges of your paint is. But if you want to define form with lines, you can use form shadows to define its form. And using the Streamline tool, this is made easier. And you can also add speed lines to define motion using the Streamline tools. Just simply adjust the length, the curve, and the variations to suit your needs. And what's great about using these tools is that you don't need to have all the answers right away. The Object subtool lets you edit the Streamline layers separately and non-destructively. And when you're satisfied, you can even convert your Streamline layers into vector layers for further refinement. And now for the bonus section where I show you how I use the figure tools to enhance the main image and thumbnail of this tutorial. Here you can see me add a saturated line figure, then use the dark saturated line tool to control the flow of the lines. Here we see me tweak the values of the brush size to control the contrast of these lines. Then I can easily tweak the length of the focus lines to fit the canvas. Once drawn, you can also move the individual control points of the figure to adjust how your lines behave. For the speed lines that define her lower leg motion, I use the curved speed line with huge gaps in between. I also used dense saturated line on the place of impact and then just tweak the settings accordingly, as I've shown you before, using the object subtool. And as I've shown you before, I also created a clean version of the Streamline subtool to create various parts of the form shadows on the girl's leg, carefully following the contour of her leg, then using a layer mask to erase away some unwanted areas where I don't want the lines to fall on. What's great about this kind of workflow is that you can go back and edit your lines if you feel that it's not what you initially wanted or if it doesn't look right. I also used speed lines with various settings and lengths to create the speed lines that mimic motion blur in the fastest moving elements, such as her leg. Combining lines generated using the figure subtool with existing manual line work and with the use of layer masks, I was able to create this thumbnail panel faster than it would have taken me if I had done it without the figure tools. Thank you very much for sticking around. I hope you learned something useful. If you're interested to learn any aspects of creating illustrations and pieces using Clip Studio Paint's tools, or if you're interested to see a certain aspect of my workflow, or maybe you'd just like to see more long-form content, let me know in the comments section below. I also included a link in the description to a Discord server I just made recently. Feel free to drop by with your questions, and hopefully I can answer them. Again, thanks for watching.